Is it Mangiza? Say Mangiza.
Mutiso Mangiza.
Mangiza.
Yeah.
Good morning and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies. In just under 2 weeks, we will have the next democratic election in South Africa, an election that some have referred to as potentially a turning point in South Africa's democracy. Today, this morning, I, Otilia Anamaunganidze, will be directing you through a discussion on the South African elections, what to expect, what the projections are, and what this means for South Africa's democracy. Joining me today is Dr. Yaki Cilia, who heads the African Futures and Innovation program here at the Institute for Security Studies and also chairs our Board of Trustees. We have the Deputy Minister in the Department for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Deputy Minister Andre Snell, who previously also served as the Deputy Minister for Constitutional Development and has been an ANC MP since 1994, having held several portfolios both for the ANC as well as within government during that time. The last person you will hear from today is Dr. Shingai Mutizwa Mangiza, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Political Science Department at the University of the Western Cape. All three very able people who over the years have not only analyzed what's to come for this election, but have also looked at previous elections, whether as active participants, as candidates, but also as analysts of the political situation. What we will have this morning is first the public component of the seminar, which will be live streamed, and for that I welcome our online audience. After the public component of the seminar, we will then close the live stream and have a closed roundtable type discussion, which will be held under Chatham House rule. So, it's very rare that as a woman I get to pose all of the questions and you must respond.
Be quick.
At least for you, Yaki, when you wrote your three scenarios for South Africa a couple of years ago now, the idea that the 2019 elections could be a turning point after the entry into politics of the economic freedom fighters, for example, and the change in the way in which the public has perceived the ANC. Do you still think 2019 is a turning point?
Otilia, yes. I do think this is the start of real change in South African politics. I wrote Fate of the Nation in 2017, just ahead of the December 2017 ANC National Conference, elective conference, that saw the triumph of the reformist faction by a very narrow margin in South Africa. The triumph of Cyril Ramaphosa with a divided party. And those divisions have not settled yet. So the first reason why we are going to see these elections as critical is we are going to see the unfolding of the intense battle for dominance between what I refer to then as the traditionalist and the reformist faction of the party. Then the traditionalists were headed by Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Today one could say it's headed by Ace Magashule and others. And the reformist faction which won by President Ramaphosa. So how that balance will play out, I think, is going to be determined by the results of the election. So I think in that sense, it is hugely important because the major challenge, in my view, that President Ramaphosa faces down the line, and this is the start of that, is the reform of the party. The party is hugely divided. And the direction in which the party decides to go will be determined by these elections. If the reformist camp within the ANC triumphs, I think long term we are looking at an ANC that probably enters into an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, unlikely as that may seem at the moment. If the traditionalist faction manages to upend things, the alliance with the economic freedom fighters becomes much more likely. The differences in the future of South Africa will be dire, particularly in the latter case. So in that sense, the divisions within the ANC, I think, and how that plays out. The second one, of course, in which this election is going to be very critical, is what happens in Gauteng. And what happens in Gauteng, where I expect most likely the ANC will lose its majority, but no other party will be able to, will gain a majority. So we are entering the start of alliance politics. And alliance politics is the future of South Africa because of our proportional representation system. And what happens in Gauteng and the alliances that then happen after the 8th of may be a precursor to the future alliances, particularly 2024, when the ANC, depending on what happens with its internal battle, is very likely to go under 50% at the national level. And that's when our proportional system locks us into a permanent system of, somebody referred to, then we then have a permanent CODESA in South Africa. Now that's going to work out. So I think for those two reasons, I would think that this is really the start of substantive change in South Africa's political future. It may not, I will hopefully a little bit later show my forecast for what they are worth. But I think Gauteng is absolutely going to be a key province in terms of the future of South Africa, and that starts with this election.
Deputy Minister, you've heard quite a bit being said about the ANC, but I think also the future of governance. You wear two hats, and you're free to pick which hat you can speak on these issues on. But you know, Yaki's raised quite a number of points around what 2019 means. I think what Yaki's saying is 2024 will be perhaps more of that watershed moment, but it starts now. These changes and so forth start now. So I'm going to pose the question to you. In preparations for the election, both coming from your portfolio within cooperative governance, but also, I suppose, your experience as a member of parliament, what can we expect?
Thank you very, very much. Look, we're literally on the eve of celebrating 25 years of democracy, and we are also on the eve of our 6th democratic national and provincial elections. So I think these elections very much represent both continuity but also change. They represent continuity in the sense that I think it's an indication of the further maturing and the deepening and the consolidation of our democracy. And I think one of the things that we have to celebrate about the past 25 years is that even though our road since 1994 has not always been smooth, and I think as the ANC we admit that we've also veered off course, that we've made some very, very serious mistakes, that we are in the process of correcting, both at the level of government as well as the level of the party. But I think what we can celebrate is that through all of those difficulties, our institutions, the institutions that we designed at the outset of our democracy, have by and large stood the test of time, and they've done what they were designed to do. So I think that's the continuity. The change, as the world is always changing, is that we've seen the emergence of a variety of political tendencies, the emergence of new parties. And I'm going to speak, I'm not going to choose hats, I'm going to alternate them. I'd like to start off just governmentally with just a very few remarks to say that I think all indications are that we are ready for these elections. As government, there is an interministerial committee consisting of the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, police, state security, justice, defense, communications, etc., working very, very closely with the IEC to make sure that as government we respect the independence of the IEC, but at the same time play that supportive role, especially in terms of logistics, making sure, for example, that there's adequate deployment of police and other security forces, making sure that the disasters that have occurred, for example, in KZN are attended to, that people are helped, but also that electoral infrastructure is in place. and also that we attend to many of the service delivery protests that have increasingly become linked to the electoral process, and that on election day all citizens can vote with confidence that they would be safe to exercise their democratic rights. Changing hats. I think the ANC, ever since the 2017 National Conference, has recognized that there were things that went wrong and that went seriously wrong. And I think President Ramaphosa was given the mandate both to unite the party, but also to correct the wrongs that have occurred within the party, and also to unite the nation and to address the issues that have gone wrong in the nation. And I think that has received tremendous resonance throughout society. I think there is a willingness of South Africans to come together around that program. And I think much as it's important to look at predictions around what might happen with this party or that party, I think it would be equally important to look at the underlying social forces in our society and the social fault lines that we need as a society to deal with. 25 years into democracy, our society is still characterized by huge levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. We are, in many senses, a very divided society. There are hugely divergent agendas on the basis both of race and class. And I think for that reason it's very important that an organization like the ANC, which is a broad church, which tries to unite as many of those social forces as possible, and President Ramaphosa in particular, who's been a very, very staunch advocate of the development and the consolidation of a social compact between government, business, labor, and citizens, is given a strong mandate to continue that work. I hear what Dr. Silier is saying about coalition politics. I think to the extent that that reflects real tendencies, it's something that we need to engage. I would though caution against those that get very excited as if coalition politics is going to spell some miraculous new chapter in our political life. Because quite frankly, coming from my experience as a Deputy Minister of Local Government, the track record of coalition has been, quite frankly, has been dismal. And what we've seen is not an increase in accountability, an increase in responsiveness, an increase in participation, but rather very often a very, very dirty scramble to assemble votes, and very often just the consolidation of alliances around feeding troughs, as opposed to an alliance based on principle. And I think that's really what President Ramaphosa is talking about. If we look back at the outset of our democracy in 1994, where we had a government of national unity, that was not a coalition because the ANC needed votes. That was a grand coalition in a sense because our society had very deep fault lines and we needed an all-inclusive approach. So I think that we're working towards that all-inclusive approach, not a counting up of electoral support. Because very often that leads to an inability to drive a coherent national agenda. It's because each coalition partner wants their sectoral, narrow sectoral interests fed, sometimes literally. So I think
it sounds like a description of the ANC itself.
So yeah, just in short, I do think that all of the opinion surveys indicate that the ANC does enjoy a very strong confidence amongst South African citizens. We hope that the ANC and that the President will get a very strong, resounding mandate to continue with this work.
Thank you. Shingai, you've heard what Yaki and the Deputy Minister have to say in terms of what to look forward for come the 8th of May. Now, from the work that you've been doing, mapping and looking at election trends, but also looking at what we ought to be expecting, are they right?
Otulia, I have to say that they actually are both right in a sense, although for different reasons. Allow me to explain that. Honorable Nell had mentioned that it's very much a process of continuity, and to that extent, you could say that you could characterize it as a process of continuity, and this would be in regards to the actual electoral process itself. As you mentioned, you're talking of the sixth national election that we've had. Now, there are no real issues around the logistics of the election, whether they're going to be free or fair, whether there are going to be any serious irregularities to watch out for. So to that extent, I would argue that yes, we can expect a process of continuity. I don't expect any fundamental disruptions in that regard. As it pertains to the actual results, well, this would be contingent upon which polling data you subscribe to or look at. Ipsos, of course, in its recent March poll had the ANC polling at 61%. So essentially, this idea that they would not dip below the the 60% logic. Afrobarometer in its 2018 poll, I think this was September, had put the ANC dipping to somewhere about 48%. So again, we all understand the nature of polling, and if I can quote Mark Twain, he says, you have lies, damned lies, and you have statistics. So, of course, it's difficult to kind of ascribe which ones to speak to. But broadly speaking, I think the general perception, if you're to take the latter view of Afrobarometer, this would largely be based on this idea of the experience of the 2016 municipal elections. The idea that the ANC, despite getting a plurality of the votes, didn't actually retain a majority so as to retain the main metros, your Joburg, your Pretoria, as well as Nelson Mandela Bay. So if those projections and if those trends are to continue, then, as Yaki had said, we might have ourselves a situation of coalition-based politics. On the other hand, though, I think it's also important to take into account that in recent months, a lot of these political parties, there's been a lot more scrutiny, and I think the political dynamics have kind of changed, I think, following the events of, early February last year, and the handover. First and foremost, I think we have to remember that what was one of the main polarizing or the main vote assurers for the opposition or the DA was the Zuma factor, if I may put it that way. So now with the departure of Zuma, there's this sense that, the gift that kept on giving is no longer a factor within this political cycle. And so it's put a lot of scrutiny around the internal functionings, both within the DA in terms of their actual policies, one looking at the issues of BEE, one looking at in terms of their policies in regards to diversity, again also looking in terms of the inner workings of their politics. We saw what happened in Cape Town with the Patricia de Lille saga, etc., etc. Again, we also look and see with the other political parties, such as the EFF, again, all these sorts of controversies coming up in regards to the VPS. Now, it still remains to be seen the actual impact it will have. But what we can say, I think, is that it will be consequential to the extent that this election, much like the 1994 election, is the first election, I think, in a long time where we're actually genuinely interested in the outcome. Previously, it was a foregone conclusion. We all focused on the elective conferences of the ANC and wondered who would take over, which faction would take over. Whereas in this case, if the idea of the ANC's electoral hegemony dipping below, 50% is to be held true, then that does actually make it a much more competitive election. Now, as I said, it remains to be seen whether that will be, we will have a situation of coalition politics, or we'll have, a situation whereby you still have some sort of dominance of the ANC. So that's essentially the position.
Yeah. Shinga, even though you quoted Mark Twain on why statistics don't necessarily matter, you're the first really to introduce numbers. And I think what you've said is that it's anyone's guess. Now, I'm going to leave you to sit there, Yaki, so I control the PowerPoint for you. But in terms of some of, not just Ipsos or Afrobarometer, we have seen quite a number of predictions or forecasts, some of them which seem to be along the same page. It has, and I'm going to let Yaki speak to this, he knows numbers way better than I do, I just talk. But speak to, this potential of dipping below 60% or just staying a little bit over 60%. But first, history.
Atulia, thanks a lot. So this is from Fate of the Nation, the book that I did about where South Africa is going till 2034. So that's the historical trend. It includes both national and provincial elections, and you can see the basic trend. The ANC support is coming down structurally. Opposition support, both EFF and DA, are coming up structurally. This is the story of Africa. It is almost inevitable. It would take a huge effort from the ANC to turn those trends around. So we can see, for example, at the moment, nationally, the ANC is 62.1%. They dipped to 53.9% at the local government elections, while the EFF have gone from 6.4% to 8.2% national and local in 2014 versus 2016. The DA from 22.2 to 26.9%. Can we go to the next slide? So this is what I think would be a reasonable outcome of the 2019 elections. ANC about 58%. So it's still a substantive national majority. DA about 23%. A lot depends on voter turnout. If ANC supporters, many ANC supporters have either not voted, some have voted for the EFF as a protest vote, but the majority have stayed away. A lot depends what those voters do, particularly in Gauteng. EFF 10% for the EFF would be doing well. It would be going from 6%, which it has nationally, to 10%, a substantive increase, with about 9% 9% to smaller parties. And below you can see the seats in the National Assembly. The left-hand side is the 2014, the current situation. These are forecasts. They will inevitably be wrong in some or other aspect. But as I indicated, I think that the main battleground is in Gauteng. If we go to the next slide, so I think the ANC would be doing well if it got 48% in Gauteng. This is where voter turnout really becomes important. The DA about 35%, EFF about 12%, and other smaller parties 5%. Now, this is much more difficult to forecast or indicate as opposed to national level, I think. What happens in Gauteng, what happens after the 8th of May, I think is going to be critical. Does the ANC, if it falls below 50%, at 48% it can, gather a small grouping of parties and it can enter into coalition and probably govern. But it depends on which direction South African politics works. If I was Ramaphosa and I am the leader of the reformist faction and I look long-term towards the future, I see a number of clear trends. I see that the number of born-free voters are increasing. Younger, more urban-based voters are increasing. The ANC is historically an urban-based multi-ethnic party. If it wants to recapture that image, his future, in a sense, is probably an alliance with the DA in Gauteng, which sets him up for elections, and a national alliance after the 2024 election. That would be the best outcome for the ANC. It would certainly be the best outcome for South Africa. It actually, in fact, is probably the outcome that for the DA presents the biggest problem, because the DA is in a sense then in partnership with the ANC to make provincial and local government work. And if it does that, it actually itself, its own future, I wouldn't say becomes problematic, but it works itself out of a job in a sense. So it's an interesting dilemma that I think that confronts the DA. But this choice between the alliances in Gauteng in particular after May, if these forecasts are right, I think determine or could determine where we are headed longer term. Because the 2024 I think it is, unless Ramaphosa and the ANC really turn the party around. And that turnaround can only happen on a pro-business, developmentally orientated future, which means the ANC has to turn away from its current trajectory, which is in support of empowering and in partnership with traditional leadership. 17 million South Africans live under traditional leadership. And the ANC has embarked upon buying votes in partnership with the traditional leadership, which is the tradition that Jacob Zuma has taken the party. That party and the orientation of a modern party that is more urban-based and so on are not, the ANC has to make a choice. And that choice is really the difficult, if it makes that choice of the continued partnership with traditional leadership, it cannot form, it will be very difficult to enter into alliance, for example, with the DA. Then the future is an alliance with the EFF, and South Africa's future is probably fairly dismal and dark. Only a pro-investment, pro-business, pro-international investment orientation can build jobs over the long term in South Africa. So these are the choices that I think confront the ANC, and that could set us up for what is going to happen in 2024. Whether the ANC is capable of reform. It is a hugely divided party. And it is a coalition itself. It's always been a coalition. So if we can go on, was there one more slide there? I'm not sure if, okay. That was basically, so that's the forecast and and the choices that face us, that face the ANC particularly after the elections on the 8th of May.
Thank you, Yaki. I'm going to turn to you, Deputy Minister. Yaki has suggested, ways in which things could work post-election. But he's also said, and here again, I don't know how many hats you can wear today. But, he's also suggested, stated quite clearly, that choices have to be made. And that those choices could be choices that the ANC makes itself, or choices that other political parties make. Earlier this week, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters said, well, if we are going to be in any form of a partnership or a coalition, they said it wouldn't be with the DA, that it would be with the ANC. From what Yaki has said, what are your thoughts on, you've already alluded to your position now in terms of the ways in which coalitions to date have governed or misgoverned in the country. But if that is going to be the definite future of the way we govern, shouldn't we think about making it work somehow? And how would that be?
Sure. Well, I think, again, let me do I hesitate to call it a hat trick, but
we should have actually, you know what we should have done, Deputy Minister? I should have had two hats and sort of handed it to you.
Let me start off with the governmental hat. I think just to continue on the theme of continuity and change. I think regardless of the different scenarios that play themselves out, I think a further indication of the consolidation and the deepening of our democracy is that in the 2016 elections, where a party that hitherto had enjoyed a majority in the biggest metropolitan areas in our country lost their majority, there was a transition to an opposition-led coalition government. And that handover was peaceful, it was smooth. It hasn't always continued smoothly, but that is the nature of politics. So I think, very often people have said that the test of democracy does not lie only in the holding of elections, but in how society and the parties accept and act upon the outcome of those elections. And I think, again, it's an indication that our democracy is indeed healthy, it is consolidating, it's growing stronger, and it's dealing with all of the challenges that come its way. So, okay, now, other hat. Look, again, I maybe just to start off with the coalitions. Generally, what has tended to happen at a municipal level is that you have two major contending parties. It's either, in certain provinces, it's the ANC and the DA. In other provinces, it would be the ANC and the IFP. Neither of them get an outright majority. And then there's a number of very, very small parties that then hold the balance of power and who then advance extremely high prices for their support and proceed to extract very, very heavy rents. Many of the municipalities that I've myself have had to be part of interventions in is exactly that scenario, where a third smaller party demands that they want the mayorship, they want the municipal manager, and then they proceed to extract as much as they can out of that municipality to the point of bringing it to collapse. And in the process, what they do is, in order to insulate, to provide cover for their project, is that they proceed then also to corrupt members of both the bigger parties. And I mean, I think there's increasing evidence coming to the fore to show that that is also happening in Johannesburg and Tshwane. And that those municipalities are being effectively used as huge resource banks for certain parties. So a coalition that is merely based on a political arithmetic will be inherently unstable and, I would argue, prone to corruption and the extraction of rent. It's a different thing to, and this was discussed extensively at the ANC's national conference, is to say, given this reality that we could be facing coalitions, how do we as the ANC approach that? And we've argued very strongly that we need to do that on a principled basis. And those documents and those resolutions are there for anyone who's interested. I'm not going to go into depth. But the point then would be that I think rather than trying to engage in that political calculus, it's a question to say is that we're a country that comes from a very, very difficult, painful and divided past. Colonialism, apartheid, we've made huge advances, but we're still sitting with those very, very deep fault lines of poverty, unemployment, inequality, and those things are racialized. In many cases, they're ethnicized and they're spread out. There are huge geographic imbalances and inequalities in our society. That demands a clear, coherent national agenda, which we believe is the National Development Plan. The implementation of a National Development Plan indeed requires an all-of-society and an all-of-government approach. So you've got to consolidate that social compact. Government across the three spheres, business, labor, civil society, and all of the many, many different groupings and sectors within society to come together. So I think our first priority is how do we engage that social compact? A political series of alliances obviously might feature in that, but I don't think it's a question of aligning with this party or the other. With regard to certain recent pronouncements by certain people about their electoral or coalition preferences, I think we just need to bear in mind the general track record or lack thereof in terms of consistency of pronouncements. That very same leader, after the 2016 elections, made exactly the same pronouncements to say anybody but the DA, and well, voila, we saw what then happened. And I think again, it's just an indication of sometimes the absolutely unprincipled behavior that goes into a lot of coalition politics. As the ANC, our perspective is we need to unite the nation, where we need to engage politically. We're very, very happy to do so, but first and foremost, we want a clear electoral majority to implement the National Development Plan and to take our country forward, to grow South Africa.
So we're turning now to the elections are done, you know, the ink is dry, the numbers have been counted, whatever that may be. right? I'm not a soothsayer. Yaki does soothsaying.
That's a good description.
But in trying to build or rebuild or reshape, in reshaping governance in South Africa, right? Whether it's a coalition, whether it's one party that has a sufficient majority in order to be able to push those kinds of reforms. I mean, the Deputy Minister's already restated, and I think it always bears repeating what some of the issues are that need to be addressed. That poverty needs to be addressed, that inequality needs to be addressed, the issue around rising unemployment for an urbanizing society, but also the fault lines along race as well as class. Now, Shingai, looking into your magical solutions bucket, right? You know, you've got all the answers. You're a postdoctoral fellow working on political science, you know. What can we do?
And can I borrow it afterwards?
Yes, exactly. You're advising the Deputy Minister here and anyone else who's listening. But mindful of all of these things, you know, perhaps, and it's a weird thing to say just before elections, perhaps forgetting the politics a bit. What needs to be done?
Well, that's quite a lot to put on. Essentially, I think, as the Deputy Minister alluded to, I think what has happened is that, you know, following the last few years, there's a sense that the nation, there's been, you know, this gulf that has kind of emerged, and that there's been a polarization of the political space and that sort of thing. I think possibly the first approach would be to try and forge, you know, some sort of consensus across the various sectors. I mean, on the one hand, of course, you know, there's this tendency to view this diametrically opposed relationship between, you know, obviously labor and business and that sort of thing. And we've obviously seen in the last 2 years just how that has kind of played out. On the other hand, of course, there's obviously the social element. And again, we're talking about the issues of inequality and poverty, unemployment being the biggest thing. So I think what possibly I would probably suggest is that, putting the politics aside, I think if South Africa can think of arriving at a position where we have some sort of consensus-based politics, I think there's a realization that because we do live in a constitutional democracy, now a constitutional democracy does not necessarily mean that political parties have to be, you know, entirely antagonistic to one another, irregardless of their ideological or programmatic positions and outlooks generally. I think there has to be a sense that the South African public and the, you know, demands or the needs of the republic and of the population writ large should come first. So I think, I don't know how possible that will be, as we said, given the fractious politics, but I think if I were in that position, I would probably initiate, whether I'm, you know, in the ANC winning an election, whether I'm the DA or the EFF for that matter. I think I'd want to sort of look for, you know, some policies, you know, whether they be from the National Development Plan or new policies for that matter, because I think there's always room for contribution. So I think consensus would be the first step. I think there would also have to be, in order to allay particular fears or that sort of thing, I think there'd also have to be a very dynamic approach, I think, in as far as policy formulation around the issues of unemployment and inequality. Again, I think there needs to be a real discussion in terms of the concrete approaches. Does that mean creating more jobs in the public sector? Does that mean expanding the private sector? Does that mean creating programs that actually introduce some sort of financial or economic literacy to the population, you know, writ large? I think there has to be, going forward, you know, a real, you know, as I said, a real focus on the actual, the nuts and bolts of policy, and not just broad statements, you know, that appeal to particular political constituencies. I think there needs to be a real articulation on the actual, you know, the minutiae of policy and what that actually means. So that would be the second thing. Because again, that also speaks to that also speaks to the various constituencies in society. That's your business, that's your label. They'll be able to get a sense as to what the government the true intentions of the government of the day would be. Again, on the issue of social cohesion, there has been this debate whether we should have the reintroduction of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, given the fact that some of the trauma that exists, continues to exist in various forms. Others, maybe whether it's in the form of spatial separation, maybe if it's a form of inequitable access to particular resources or opportunities. I'm not entirely sure how that would actually work out, but I think essentially there must be some sort of recommitment to the nation-building project. I think this idea of the Rainbow Nation, in some senses, had sort of begun to fray. And again, as you said, this sort of atomization between different racial or ethnic groups was beginning to rear its head. And so I think this idea of some sort of national cohesion, whether that you have a formal commission doing it, whether that means community leaders, with the church, but I think there needs to be, again, more concrete steps in that regard, and not mere pronouncements, radio adverts. There needs to be a real thought-out approach in regards to what social cohesion means and what it actually means in terms of the future going forward. Because I think only then, can we begin to, really seriously think of ourselves as South Africans in that sense, and not merely people living in South Africa without feeling a part of.
Natalia, can I make a point here? There is nothing more important in South Africa than getting the economy growing. Nothing more important. Without growth, none of those other things are possible. Without growth, South Africa's future is clear, and it is a relatively dark, violent, unequal future. Only the private sector can grow South Africa. We no longer have the choice. Government has spent all the money that it has. It has wasted it. It is given it to the Guptas. It is stolen it. We have no choice. If you want to grow the economy, you need a pro-business, investment-friendly economy. It's not an ideological matter. It's an entirely practical matter. And that's why the choices that we make in the months that are ahead, in terms of the direction in which we set up our country, are going to be important. Yes, we have a national development plan. We just don't implement it. Yes, we talk left and we walk right to a degree, but nobody knows where the country is headed. So I think the critical thing for me, before all else, is to rebuild international confidence and local business confidence in South Africa. And that is not possible if the wrong decisions are made going forward, and in terms of which direction, whichever faction of the ANC we're talking about now. If the ANC proceeds on its current divided trajectory, the future is a confused, continued, bumbling along scenario. I think unemployment, poverty, inequality, these things are only possible to deal with if we have a growing economy. And for me, that is absolutely the critical thing. Once we get that going, there are many other things that have to happen. But I think that that to me sets up where the ANC also needs to go, because it remains the most important party at a national level in South Africa. It may have to go into a coalition into the heart of South Africa's economy, Gauteng, with a partner. But I go back to the reason why I then say it depends on the choice that it makes. If it puts together a coalition of smaller, insignificant parties, if I can use that term, who extract rents, then Gauteng and South Africa will suffer. We need a growth coalition in South Africa. And that growth coalition is certainly not a coalition between the ANC and the EFF. And it is not a tradition with traditional leadership in South Africa. In actual fact, they're a huge obstacle to growing this country, because we need to move to individual title hold and all of those kind of things if we are going to grow rural areas and all of these kind of things. So, for me, economy, number one.
I had a running list of words beginning with C that you've all used, and it was a fairly positive list until you added confused. But with all of what you've said now, Yaki, right? With all of what you've said, we have seen at the very least we have seen South Africa moving forward, as it were. And I often quote you, Yaki, and I quote the first line of the last chapter of Fate of the Nation, which is that South Africa is in a much better place today than it was 30 years ago. And perhaps, and this will be the last question I pose to the three of you, and I'll start with you, Deputy Minister. Let's say we are in a better place than we were in 1994. Let's start there. Let's state it as a fact. Are we in the place we could have been? And in line with what Shingai as well as Yaki have been responding to now, what can be done to make sure that our trajectory is a positive trajectory? So actioning the National Development Plan, but what else?
Sure. No, I think indisputably we are in a better space 25 years into democracy than we were before democracy. And I think it's absolutely senseless. And it's just a completely wrong and I think futile starting point to start anywhere else. Could we have been further? Absolutely. And I think we, as the ANC, we're saying very, very clearly that a number of mistakes have been made. We veered off course. We're pulling back onto course. But I would just like to get back to some of the points raised earlier. I would agree that the economy needs to grow. And I think that's why in the ANC's election manifesto, we say, grow South Africa together. But I think that element of together needs to be triple underlined. And it relates then also to, I think, what some of the economists were saying when the Minister of Finance pulled them together at the beginning of the year, including some of the international economists. I think it was Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard who posed the question to say, when you South Africans talk about us, what exactly do you mean? What is your sense of us? And I think for me the starting point is exactly that. I mean, we need to embark on an all-out national effort to reinforce and to build that South African sense of us. That goes along with developing very, very deep levels of trust amongst citizens, amongst the different sectors, amongst the different groupings in society, amongst geographically, class, race, gender. And that will define whether we become what our constitution, that vision of our constitution of a nation united in diversity, or simply people living together separately. And without that sense of us, that sense of trust, it's going to be very difficult to grow the economy. To simply have a narrow, economically focused, business focused approach, I don't think is going to get us to where we need to be. Yes, we need that. That is absolutely indispensable. But that will not happen if we don't build that social compact, that we engage in some of the very difficult dialogues that we need to engage in. Yes, the ANC has made mistakes. Yes, government has made mistakes. But let us not forget that that very same private sector has engaged in the most despicable, rapacious behavior, has looted the money of pensioners and the most vulnerable in our society. The levels of greed and drive for profit beyond anything that is humanly possible to consume must also be moderated and curtailed.
By an ANC government which has stolen this country. Which is...
Wait, let me... I listened very attentively, and that's why I'm responding very precisely. For that to happen, we need to build that social compact. Within that, the state and a strong, capable, developmental state needs to play a leading role. It can only do so if it has the trust of the different partners in society. Wait. part of building that trust is correcting the wrongs, the very things that you've referred to. And I think that's why in the year and a bit that President Ramaphosa has been in office, I mean, he's gone all out to institute investigations. He has moved very swiftly, and swiftly, yet absolutely procedurally, to reinforce some of the key institutions like the NPA, like reinforcing things like the asset forfeiture unit, like establishing a panel of judges to hear applications that arise out of special investigating unit investigations. He's re-established an investigating directorate in the prosecuting authority to deal with the evidence coming out of, amongst others, the Zondo Commission. Those are things that need to happen in order for citizens to enjoy confidence in the state. But beyond that, I mean, we need to, I think we need to focus on building the technical capacity of our state. We also need to enhance the ability of the state to plan coherently across national, provincial and local spheres, but importantly to be planning with citizens and planning with those key sectors, including business. We need to manage our intergovernmental relations much better. And I think that's something which I experience, is how government very often comes into a local space in a disjointed manner. That is what we need also to solve. We need the ability also to have policy coherence and to stick to those long-term policies like the National Development Plan. So I think there's the post-election tasks, I think would be for me really, if you want to capture them in a nutshell, it's building a strong developmental state that has the confidence of citizens. Secondly, building and reinforcing that social compact.
So
Can I just say a word
we've
about
moved
that?
from CODESA to coalitions to Yaki jumping out of his chair. I'm going to give each of you one last word, whether it's in response to what's been said or something that we missed in the discussion. I'll start with you, Yaki. One last word.
Yeah, we do not differ. There is the role of the state is to regulate, and the role of the private sector is to grow the economy. And there's yes, we need a developmental strong state, because it needs to deal with the legacies of South Africa, poverty, inequality, and so forth. We have, there's absolutely no doubt about that, and I don't think there's any ideological or other difference. But the governing party is itself the main looter in South Africa, and these choices that need to be made in looking at where we want to go in terms of local and provincial and national government are they're going to set South Africa on a particular pathway. And the orientation at the moment, as it has been for such a long time, is particularly concerning, particularly the alliance that we see emerging between the ANC and traditional leadership, the ongoing building of that alliance, which is an alliance built on patronage, of buying of traditional support for electoral purposes. It serves, it's in contrast to our constitution, our law. It has been thrown out by the Constitutional Court, yet the ANC proceeds on that. So there are contradictions that we need to make choices on. And this is what concerns me. If we want to build and my argument is not that the private sector must somehow, because I agree with your views on you can't leave them to do this. But we literally have in many senses run out of options and money. We need international investment in South Africa, we need local investment, and we need to grow the economy. And yes, we need a social compact to do that. But I wonder if that's possible, given South Africa's dire current economic circumstances. We first need to change the nature of the debate and get a positive trajectory going before I think we'll be able to bring this alliance together. But I think we speak the same language when it comes to what needs to be done. I just think that the choices are will need to be made quite earlier, after the 8th of May. And the political choices. In South Africa, politics determines policy to a large extent in our economic growth trajectory. And I think that those choices, particularly in what's going to happen in Gauteng, are going to be critical. If you want a stable alliance in Gauteng, stable alliance, a pro-growth alliance, then I think it's fairly obvious. It's if the ANC goes below 50%, it's an alliance between the ANC and the DA in Gauteng, which may set the ANC up, depending on what happens, maybe the party does manage to reform itself for a national coalition in 2024. And that's basically just the argument. It's a relationship that hopefully is built around cleaner government, a growth agenda for South Africa, and a social compact. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So that's sort of how I see a positive future for South Africa emerging.
Shingai, without using contradictions or confusion, last words.
Yes. I'd say post-election, the priority should be really about sustainable development. And by that I mean balancing the demands of growth with the demands of obviously an equitable society, that sort of thing. I mean, we can't have a society where you have inaccess obviously to adequate healthcare, adequate education, that sort of thing. Again, things like maternal health care. So I think essentially balancing the two sides, obviously growth as well as access to the important sectors. I think that'll be the fundamental challenge. Indeed, it'll be a delicate balancing act for any administration, whoever takes over, or assuming there's a change. But I think so. I mean, we live in a world increasingly where now the issue or the specter of climate change and its impact, particularly on our economic development activities, is beginning to rear its head. And so I think that is an aspect that also cannot be kind of excluded, at least in as far as the policy framework moving forward. Again, coming maybe to the politics side of things, whatever the outcome, I do tend to believe that there will be stability. And again, this is due to the fact that the fundamentals of the constitutional republic are in place. I mean, you have a strong regulatory framework, you have strong oversight mechanisms, and so I do think that, the levels of accountability as well, public accountability, I think given the fact that those are actually high, I think at least that those, do provide a sense of optimism going into the future, in the sense that whatever the situation, whatever the outcome, at least that the public and the response from the public and various sectors, whether civil society or other entities in society, that they will step up to the plate. And so I do, in that regard, I don't have any qualms about the actual, whether we're going to have a bleak outcome, whether it's going to be darkness unto death, if you want to use that sort of terminology. But as I said, I generally have a very positive and optimistic outlook. Yeah, thank you.
Deputy Minister, I can only assume your outlook would be positive, but tell us a little bit about that as your last word.
Well, again, let me start with a governmental hat. Just to say that actually voting starts on the 27th, tomorrow, for voters that are abroad. That will take place at South African embassies and consulates abroad. So anyone who is going to be abroad, please, and you've registered to vote there, please do so. Otherwise, voting will start on the 6th and the 7th, special votes, and election day is on the 8th. So please, an encouragement to all citizens to go out and to vote, to exercise your democratic rights. For those in the international community, I'm sure that many of you will be election observers. We value that participation as well. It really helps to provide transparency and to the strengthening of our democracy. And we are confident that the IEC's systems are in place for election day. There are challenges. I think there are challenges that we're working with the IEC also to try and deal with even before election day. Okay, now ANC hat. we're going into this election with a manifesto that says grow South Africa together. That implies, yes, we do need to grow our economy. Yes, we do need to attract huge levels of investment. But for that investment to have the desired result in growing our economy, we also need to pull our society together. I don't think it's a mechanical this before that. Those are things that we need to do hand in glove together. And it's exemplified by the approach followed by the President, having a job summit involving labor and business, having an investment summit bringing together both local and international business. Those are things that we need to continue. We need to consolidate after the elections. And as I said, I think the two key challenges would be to build a strong, capable, credible developmental state that will be working with business, with labor, and with citizens. Included in citizens would also be traditional leaders. I think Dr. Cilliers has referred various times to traditional leaders, and I think as a Deputy Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, it would be remiss of me not to respond to that. Just to say that our Constitution in Chapter 12 does in fact recognize traditional leadership. And it says that traditional leadership does have an important part to play in the life of our society. It's very, very clear that the traditional leadership does so within the framework of a constitution and nothing else. So that is the ambit within which we work. We support traditional leadership as government, as the ANC. Yes, we do have a close working relationship with organizations like the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa. And indeed, in many parts of the country where traditional authorities and democratically elected councils work together and define a proper working relationship, in fact, it has resulted to the benefit of all. Regrettably, there are areas where there are misunderstandings, and I think that's part of our work, is to harmonize and to bring a greater level of cooperation and understanding. But we're very, very clear that must happen on the basis of the prescripts of our Constitution. So now again, wearing my party hat, again an appeal to everyone to vote, but also to vote for the ANC, and I think to vote to give President Ramaphosa a very, very strong mandate to carry on the very good work that he has been doing. Thank you very much.
In line with what Shingai said earlier about radio adverts, I would like to say that last insert was not paid for by the political party concerned. But we've moved from CODESA to the talk of coalitions. I'm going to run you all through my list of C's as you were speaking. We've spoken about choices, about change, about capable and credible cooperative governance, consistency, cohesion, continuity, the idea that we can have concrete plans, that we can create jobs, anything to do this in order to ensure that we actually maintain a constitutional democracy. What we didn't speak about, and I hope he's not watching, we didn't talk about COPE. And one last thing, which I think everyone, whether it's in the process of voting that starts tomorrow and ends on the 8th of May, is the role that citizens play in that. And before I close off the seminar, I will very briefly show a video from Civics Academy, which is a small organization also working in terms of advancing, I suppose.
Welcome to the Civics Academy Election Series. In these videos, we explore different aspects of elections and why they are a central feature of democracy. In this video, we look at every citizen's right to free, fair and regular elections as found in Section 19(2) of the Constitution. What are free and fair elections? Elections are a central feature of democracy. For elections to express the will of the electorate, they must be free and fair. Free means that all those entitled to vote have the right to be registered and to vote, and must be free to make their choice. In South Africa, every citizen from the age of 18 is entitled to vote. An election is considered free when you can decide whether or not to vote and vote freely for the candidate or party of your choice without fear or intimidation. A free election is also one where you are confident that who you vote for remains your secret. Fair means that all registered political parties have an equal right to contest the elections, campaign for voter support, and hold meetings and rallies. This gives them a fair chance to convince voters to vote for them. A fair election is also one in which all voters have an equal opportunity to register, where all votes are counted, and where the announced results reflect the actual vote totals. To ensure that an election is free and fair, it must be run by an independent body that is not influenced by the current government. It is usually called an electoral commission. In South Africa, the Electoral Commission, also called the IEC, is mandated to fulfill this task. The IEC operates independently from government. It registers voters, manages and oversees the election day, counts the votes, and releases election results in line with the Electoral Act of 1996. To be trusted, it is necessary for the IEC to act in an open and transparent manner. It must publish the names of all registered voters, in other words, the voters' roll, and must announce election results to the public. Representatives of political parties and provincial IEC staff serve on provincial party liaison committees, PLC. PLCs monitor the conditions under which the election campaigns are conducted and identify and solve problems as soon as they arise. The Electoral Court has the power to review the correctness and procedural fairness of any decision taken by the IEC. Other people who have a special role to play in upholding free and fair elections in South Africa are election observers and party agents. Election observers are independent organizations or people from South Africa or the international community. Election observers are election watchdogs. They monitor the voting process at polling stations, the counting of votes, the compilation of results, and their announcement. In South Africa, political parties can send a maximum of 2 party agents to each polling station. Party agents are additional watchdogs to prevent fraud and cheating and to ensure the accuracy of election results provided by individual polling stations. Observers and party agents are not allowed to interfere with the election or watch voters marking their ballots. If observers and party agents do a good job, they can contribute greatly towards free and fair elections. Because there is so much at stake during elections, some individuals or groups may resort to unfair practices to improve their chances to win. It's important to guard against such electoral malpractice and fraud. This can occur at all 3 stages of an election. In the period before the election, it is very important that there is no tampering with voter registration. Political parties must also be able to campaign in any area that they choose. Everyone should be able to express their political opinion without fear or intimidation. On election day, fraud may occur in the form of bribery, voter intimidation, or the stuffing of ballot boxes with fake ballots. After the election, fraud can occur with the counting of votes or simply with the releasing of incorrect election results. Such unfair practices can lead to false election results that do not reflect the will of the people. This is not only a threat to the credibility and acceptance of elections by the wider public, but also a threat to democracy as a whole. We as voters also have a role to play in ensuring that elections are free and fair. There is a code of conduct that everyone must follow before, during, and after the elections. According to this code, it is illegal for anyone to prevent someone else from speaking to voters, interfere with a voter's right to secrecy, use language which promotes violence, intimidate candidates or voters, offer any reward for casting a vote for a party, remove or destroy posters of parties, bribe IEC officials, and prevent the IEC from doing its job. So what can you do if you detect electoral fraud and malpractice? If you have proof that the conduct of the election was not free or fair, you have the duty to report it. You can object to anything that happened during the elections that can affect the election results. As a voter, you can do this by submitting a complaint at the voting station. The person in charge of a voting station is called the presiding officer. He or she will deal with your complaint at the voting station while a counting officer manages objections during the vote counting and results phases. The presiding officer at the voting station will give you a form to fill in and must investigate your complaint. He or she is also responsible for providing you with written findings before the election results have been declared. If you are not happy with the decision, you can appeal to the Electoral Court within 3 days of the IEC's decision. A record must be kept of every complaint or objection. So remember, an election is free and fair when there is an equal opportunity for all people to register to vote, freedom for every registered voter to confidentially cast his or her vote, a fair process for all political parties to contest the elections, all votes are counted and the actual results are announced publicly, and an independent and trusted electoral commission which is supported by election observers and party agents to monitor the entire electoral process. And because we live in a democracy, it also means that you have the right to complain. Legal mechanisms are in place to safeguard your rights.
Yaki, Deputy Minister Nell and Shingai, you could have just done that. No, but thank you. Thank you to the three of you for taking us through what was at times a difficult discussion, I think, on not just what you expect of the elections, but also going forward, what that means for South Africa, South African democracy, but also for governance. So thank you, Yaki, thank you, Deputy Minister, and thank you, Shingai, for helping us in many ways unmuddle an otherwise messy political scene. And thank you to all of you who made your way here to the ISS to attend the seminar, and to the people that are tuned in online. Thank you also. A special thank you to the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office with whom we partnered for this event, and also to the Hansaido Foundation, without whose funding for this event would not have been possible. As the ISS, this work and the rest of the work that we do would not be possible without the support of our partnership forum, of which the Hansaido Foundation is a part, but also joined by the European Union and the governments of Australia, Canada, Finland, the United States, Ireland, as well as the kingdoms of Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. So thank you, and thank them. For now, we'll now close the live part of the seminar, and we will have a discussion for about an hour, which will be held under Chatham House rule.